Hello and welcome to Read All About It, the podcast where people talk about their favourite and not so favourite books. Join me, Paul Cudahy, as I take each guest on the literary journey of their life, from their most cherished childhood read and a book they'd recommend to anyone, to the book they couldn't be paid to read again, and much more in between. So listen, enjoy, subscribe and spread the word about the Read All About It podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Read All About It podcast. Now, I'm delighted to be joined on this episode by Adam Farrar. Now, Adam is a creative non-fiction writer and spoken word performer who's based in Manchester. He's the editor of The Real Story, which is an Arts Council England-funded online publisher and spoken word event series, which is working to nurture creative non-fiction talent in the UK. And his writing can also be found in numerous publications, including Squat Back, BBC Online, This Is Not TV, The Drabble, Flash Flood, and in the short story collection Flash Non-Fiction Funny. And in 2019, he became the inaugural writer-in-residence for Peel Park, Salford. Adam has performed his work at a number of arts and literature festivals, including Sheffield Doc Fest, the Rochdale Literature and Ideas Festival, the Not Quite Light Festival, and the Manchester Literature Festival. He has also run workshops on creative non-fiction writing and spoken word skills for the University of Salford, the Prestwich Arts Festival, the Northern Lights Writers' Conference, and Victoria Bath's Weekend of Words Festival. And Adam was also recently awarded a Developing Your Creative Practice grant by Arts Council England to complete his first book, a memoir and essays titled The Lost Villages of Holderness. Adam, welcome to the Read All About It podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And it's slightly ironic, as I was reading that introduction, I stumbled over the part where you teach spoken word skills, so maybe I need to sign up for one of your courses.
Yeah, there's an art to that, I guess. But I stumble all the time. I think everyone who does it stumbles.
You're too kind.
Yeah.
And I suppose just in reading this, the introduction, and obviously you and I are speaking via Skype, and we've kind of got in touch via one of the other podcasts guest, Stephen Keedy, who put me in touch with you. But just even some of the things that you're doing, very much public events, public performances. So I suppose in terms of your own work and your own performances, that's quite difficult just now with this lockdown.
It is, yeah, because we're having this grant to write about a certain part of the country. It's actually, Holderness is a stretch of the East Yorkshire coast. So the funding was to go over to that part of the country and write about the people there and the environment. And since the lockdown, I've had to do a lot because it's where my family came from. So I'm having to do a lot of memoir stuff rather than actual real-time writing. It's stopped me being able to interview people. It's been a little bit disruptive.
I suppose and that is the challenge, because obviously you would have had an idea of how you saw the book developing, which I'm guessing would have involved a lot of interviews.
Yeah. I've interviewed fascinating people in that part of the country, because it's falling into the sea, like 10 feet a year is disappearing off that coastline. And I think it kind of affects the way that people live. They seem to sort of embrace the precariousness of their existence. And I spoke to one lady, Angela, who lives in a chalet on the edge of a crumbling chalet park. And her chalet was literally on the end of the cliff, probably 6 feet away from falling off. I just sat in this little house with her, talking about her life, and she chooses to live there. Like, she wouldn't live anywhere else. One chalet fell in the sea. She just bought another one and moved into that. It's like there's some very interesting characters, so hopefully the book will capture them.
Yeah, and were you slightly nervous while you were sitting in that chalet 6 feet away from the cliff?
Terribly, yeah, because the building next door was being condemned. They were pulling all the furniture out of it. There was a whole fence panel that was hanging into the sea. All of Angela's pipes and electricity mains were all hanging out of the front of the cliff. You could just see them. It's a very precarious way of living, but she loved it. She said that her headboard is against the wall that faces the sea, and she said, I like to think that no one in the world has their head closer to the sea than I do. And she's fully embracing the idea that she just might wake up on the beach one morning, and that's the kind of thing that I find incredibly interesting about that part of the country.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds absolutely fascinating, and hopefully, fingers crossed, before too long you get the chance to perhaps get back out and speak to more of these people.
Yeah, I'm desperately missing it as well. You only realise the things that really matter when you're locked away from them, and that's that coastline and that part of the country is really in my heart, and I need to get back to it as soon as possible.
Now, in the course of the podcast, I think we'll get back to talking about, certainly your work and, your work as a writer and creative non-fiction, certainly with some of the choices you've chosen for the podcast. But it's kind of, I'm taking you on your literary journey of your life, as it were. And if we go back to your childhood for the first of your book choices, and that's your favourite book from childhood.
Yeah, that's The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, age 13 and 3/4, by Sue Townsend.
It's always quite difficult, I think, to go back and choose that one book from childhood, because that's at such an age where you're immersed in books. What was it about Adrian Mole that has kept with you?
It's the book that I've bought the most in my life. So that was actually the easiest of these choices to make. Like, I must have probably had 7 copies of that in my lifetime, because the original ones that I had were so poorly bound and very cheaply put together, they just fall apart. And I just have to buy another one. And the last copy I bought was a couple of years ago, and my daughter has it now. I've been able to pass that book on to her because it was so important to me. But I think the thing I found about Adrian Mole was how relatable he was to me. Like, he was, there's a mix of insecurity and arrogance that comes with being an adolescence. It's kind of awful that I related to him, because he's not he's not the most likable character. But yeah, I always found myself very bonded to him and his story. So I've lost count of the times that I've read that book. It's really deeply ingrained for me.
And at the time when you were an adolescent, when you were reading that, did you keep a diary yourself, or did it inspire you to keep a diary at all?
It made me want to. I started quite a few because of that, but I could never commit to it. And I know quite a few people who like the idea of being a diarist, but have never been able to keep it up more than a couple of weeks, because it's a labour in itself. The kind of writing that I've moved into now, which is largely from my own experience, and I now think, God, I wish I'd done that. For this memoir, I'm writing a lot of books from being about 16 when my family moved to Holderness. I wish that I'd had some resources to draw on, but I'm just dealing with my failing memory instead.
It's funny. I was actually reading an interview just last week with Tracy Thorne, who is part of Everything But the Girl, and is also a really good writer in her own right now. And one of the books where she writes about her teenage years in suburbia, and she kept a diary throughout that time, so she uses that as source material, and it's quite fascinating. And I think obviously she goes back and remembers this awkward teenager and who just thought life in the suburbs was awful. But it's been a really good way for her to then be able to go back and tap into that, writing a memoir now.
Yeah, I think you need the authenticity of old diaries, really, because over the years you build up an idea of yourself and what your life was like. And it's only when I'd speak to my family and go, "Oh, do you remember this? Do you remember that?" And they're like, "No, that did not happen at all." Or you build up all these false memories. It's one of the perils, I suppose, of non-fiction writing. If you've got nothing to prove your actual headspace at the time, then you just join dots that probably shouldn't have been joined.
I suppose the other side of it is, sometimes I wonder if your memory of a specific time and event in your life, and then other members of your family who experience the same event, their memories of that would be different, and they might tell two different stories about the same thing, but both of them are equally as valid.
Well, I was talking about this with my sister recently, because I've got a memory of my little brother Ben as a toddler wandering down the hall in our house and banging into a door frame and cracking his head open, and blood everywhere, and he had to be taken to the hospital, and it was all really, really dreadful. And I've got an incredibly clear memory. I can see that happening. And it was talking to my sister a couple of years ago, I found out that didn't happen at all. And the way that he cracked his head open was that he was bouncing in his little sort of baby bouncer thing in a doorway, and my elder brother pulled the baby bouncer back as far as it would go and would spring it like a catapult. And he was doing that, sort of happily playing with my little brother, and then he just went off at one side and his head smashed into the door frame, and that's how the injury happened. But what I remember is the lie that my older brother and sister told me to cover up for the crime. But it's weird how that's through repeated tellings over the years. I can't visualize the truth. I can only visualize the fiction.
And it's taken your sister up until a couple of years ago to suddenly finally admit the lie.
Yeah, she hasn't told my mum. She might find out when she listens to this.
Exactly. Maybe she should tell her now. I mean, in terms of Adrian Mole, obviously the one that you chose was the very first book. Did you end up reading the whole series? I think there was another 7 in the series.
I went as far as the Cappuccino years, I think. I didn't keep up with them to the end, and they kind of lost their charm. But I really liked Sue Townsend as a person, and I've read some of her more journalistic articles as well. So I was sort of committed to her rather than that character after a certain point. The Adrian Mole I related to was definitely like the adolescent and teenage version. So once they got out of that realm, I was less interested in him as a character.
Because I suppose you then, that divergence is, as you get older, your own reading habits and your own reading tastes completely change in how you are. And it's just that one period in your life that you can relate to someone.
There was a point where I considered I was reading more worthy writers, being a pretentious Adrian Mole kind of character. So I need to read some big hitters so I can feel cool about myself or be seen with a certain kind of book. I definitely became that kind of terrible character.
Right. Well, we might go on to talk about that in your next choice. It's interesting, your next choice of book in the formative years is Lonesome Traveller by Jack Kerouac, and that maybe relates in some respects, I'm guessing, to some of the way you've developed as a writer, as a performer, given it's a kind of non-fiction series of essays.
Yeah, because it was. I didn't realise it was non-fiction until a few years ago. I just presumed it was yet another of his fiction pieces. But it resonated with me at the time when I read it. I was probably 17 or 18, and I was in a band, and I was travelling around a lot, mostly to and from rehearsals, and thinking about, it'd be great to be on the road and to be actually seeing the world through this like a lone wolf in a way as well. Like, because I envisioned myself as a singer-songwriter, traveling around the world with my guitar, like all those kind of very teenage thoughts of what it'd be like to be a cool adult. And Jack Kerouac really fitted into that idea of the kind of person I wanted to be. But there's a beautiful essay in there called, let me just grab my copy of it. Yeah, it's called Alone on a Mountaintop, and it's about him working as a fire warden in a forest, and these ideas of him sitting in his elevated hut making coffee on a little stove. And that was a really romantic image that I wanted to drop myself into as well. I was always looking to escape, I think, and discover a bit of adventure, and that book that really fell in line with the things that I actually wanted.
I mean, you mentioned earlier you got to a certain point where you wanted to be seen to be reading more worthy books, and obviously names that people would know. And I've spoke to a lot of people where On the Road is a book that many people read in their formative years, partly for that reason. But did you read Lonesome Traveller first, or did you read On the Road as well, or what brought you to that particular Jack Kerouac book?
That was the first one that I found in a shop. Like I learned who Jack Kerouac was, but I didn't know where to start. And this was in a discount bookshop for £2. So I picked it up and gave it a go. And I didn't actually listen, because I haven't read it, but I listened to the audiobook of On the Road last year. And I hated it. Like, really, it annoyed me quite quickly. I think it's a book that I probably would have loved at the same time when I first read Lonesome Traveller. But now it feels like a bit of a pose. I don't know how other people have reacted to it. And I know one of the episodes I listened to, someone wasn't particularly enamored with it anymore.
It seems to be a book of not so much of its time, but of a time in your life, and certainly people who have maybe come to it later have maybe more had that reaction that you've had than absolutely loving it.
Yeah, I think it's certainly. I don't know if I read Lonesome Traveller now, fresh for the first time, if I'd be that interested in it. But I've got this real affection for what it meant to me at the time. So it's elevated by the time it arrived in my hands.
Because when I was reading through your introduction, and obviously mentioning creative non-fiction is something that you're very much involved in, and what would be, for people who maybe don't know, what would be the difference between creative non-fiction and just what people might normally define as non-fiction?
Broadly, it's non-fiction writing that allows you to employ the toolkit of fiction writing. So you can, I suppose, trying to think of the best way to describe it, because it's very difficult to get a handle on, because there's lots of different genres. You could define memoir as creative nonfiction, you could define autobiographies as creative nonfiction, and I feel like the first person I think of as a creative nonfiction writer is someone like David Sedaris, who would write about his life, the true occurrences of his life, but he will tweak things to make real life slightly more interesting. He will amplify a conversation. He'll build a scene in the way that you would in fiction writing, and just elevate a true life story. So it's a trick, I guess, of pumping up your true stories and making them more readable.
Now, you and I have never actually met, but actually when people listen to this, they'll think that we've rehearsed this brilliantly, because mentioning David Sedaris brings us perfectly on to your next choice, which is a book that you would recommend to anyone, and that's Dress Your Family in Corduroy and Denim by David Sedaris.
Yeah, I think I would recommend it because it feels like the gold standard for comic writing for me. Like I think that's the thing that I enjoy most. I like funny writers and people who can also move you, and I think he gets that balance really well in this book. I think it's maybe the third or fourth collection that he released, but that's the one where he really defined himself, I think, and really hit his stride. There's a piece called 6 to 8 Black Men that's about his analysis of the Dutch Christmas story. And the way that he analyzes that and pulls it apart and structures the whole essay, I can't think of a more perfect piece of comic writing than that. So that is one of 22 essays in this collection. It would be the book I recommend based on that story alone.
Yeah.
But the whole collection, I think, from top to bottom is as close to perfect as you would find.
Again, it's one of the things that I say on every podcast episode, and you know, some of the book recommendations are ones that I think I need to go and read, because the only collection that I've read of his, it was the Santaland Diaries, which was the Santaland Diaries essay, and then I think 5 or 6 other stories related to Christmas, and I really loved the book, but it's something that, you know, I've never then gone back and read anything else of his. But you know, I just reading up on that particular book, it makes me want to go and get it and read it, just because it's not something that I read a lot of that kind of creative nonfiction.
Yeah, well, he is a brilliant starting point, I think, and also the audio recordings of that, because he really shines as a performer. And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy about him as well, being a spoken word performer myself. I like the rhythm that and the delivery that he brings to his pieces. Like, they really come alive when he reads them. I think, I would rank the recordings of this like 2 or 3% more than the book, because they just lift it up even further. So I saw him do a short talk and a signing when he put his diaries out a few years ago, and he was talking about how he'd learned how to write through performance. So he would go and read these journal entries and read his true stories in front of an audience, and that's how he would develop. Like, he'd learn immediately what was working in a story based on that immediate feedback, that audience feedback. And it's a way that I've stolen that route, really. So I try and read stories as often as possible in front of an audience, and there's a line that you've really worked on and you think is incredible. You read it, there's a flat line in the room, and you go, oh, okay, it's just me then. and so it's a good way of developing your writing, I think. So he's someone I look to a lot in terms of as close to an icon as I would have.
You know, there's two elements there of the skill in writing, and I'm talking, you know, in terms of yourself, of being able to put yourself on the page, particularly if you're, you know, writing stories for yourself, of your own story, but then having the nerve to go up and perform in front of people. And as you say, it's kind of any sort of public performance, whether it's music or stand-up or spoken word, you have that potential to die on stage, so you have to kind of get over those nerves, I suppose, every time you do it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've died a couple of times. I think once you do it, and then you go, oh, okay, well, I'm not dead, really. You know, it hurt a lot, but I've learned something from it. There was one event that I did a few years ago where I read a story, and it was a true story, but it involved someone saying something that was a bit inappropriate. It was a dirty story, but it was a terrible true thing from my university years. And I got stopped halfway through the performance. I was like, no, it's a little bit too near the knuckle. You need to get off stage. And that's the most shame I've ever felt, like going, oh, I had to stand at the back of the venue while the audience scowled at me as I just walked away. But then afterwards, a few people came up to me and said, we need to know how this story ends, like, because they were compelled enough. So I still was able to claw something from that. It's like, okay, some of the audience cared, even though I was broadly objected to as a terribly filthy man.
As you say, that's an experience that you definitely learn from.
Yeah. I always think, well, it's never going to get that bad. You know, short of literally dying on the stage, I don't think it's going to get as bad or as embarrassing as that one time.
And then I suppose, are you then tempted at some future point, you think that's brilliant material for an essay?
Exactly. Yeah, this is the thing. Like, it's creative nonfiction is incredibly liberating because it frees you from the burden of writing plots. Because as long as you can spot the arc in what's happening and tie things together properly, then it's all there. Because I consider myself to be a reasonably lazy person, so that life just hands you stories. Like my mum is a burlesque dancer, my mum and my sister are part of a group called the Ruby Red Performers, who were on the semi-finals of Britain's Got Talent a few years ago. And talking to my mum about that and just living through that experience of them being on TV, it's like, oh, they just handed me an entire story with the development, and there's like peril because of the appearing on live TV and the live vote and all of this stuff. It's all there, so I didn't have to make anything up. I was just handed a complete tale. So it's a real gift. Life, and it never stops. Life just never stops. Keep handing you stories as long as you're paying attention.
The only thing I would ask about that is, I read a memoir a few years ago by a guy called Michael Tierney, who is a friend of mine. He wrote a book called My First Game with My Father, and it was all about the first game of football he went with his dad, and his dad had suffered a stroke and so was basically housebound, and Michael was telling the story of how football linked him and then his story of his dad's life. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, I wonder if he's had to maybe speak to his siblings about that, and I wonder, when you're writing essays, whether you think, how are my family going to react to this? Because obviously, as you say, you're telling the story, but you're mining their lives as much as your own.
Absolutely. Well, when I first started doing it, I made that mistake of thinking, because I've got a very open family that talks about everything. So I wrote an essay about my brother died a few years ago in Holderness, in this area that I'm writing about now. And I wrote an essay about how I feel about it and his funeral and sort of some interactions that we'd had, published it, and it caused a lot of damage. And I had to do a lot of repair work with my family and get them to trust me and understand my motivations for doing it. And because of that really big mistake, I'm incredibly cautious of how I treat my family now. My mum has given me, she's a bit of a show-off, so she's given me carte blanche to write whatever I like about her. So I know I don't need to check with her, but anyone else in my family, I would go to and go, right, you've got the editing power here. If there's anything you don't like, you can remove that. And I'm always happy to take that out because they're the most important people to me. And the last thing I want to do is hurt them. But yeah, it's occasionally you can lose a really good bit of a story because you have to be a good person. So, but yeah, ultimately you think, yeah, if I press ahead with this, I'm a bad human being. So I have to be honourable about it.
Yeah, there was some regret in your voice there as you admitted that's what you have to do.
Yeah, I've lost some good things, but yeah, for the right reason, so I can live with it.
And just the last word on David Sedaris' collection, when I was, again, just doing some research on it, Dress Your Family in Corduroy and Denim, and apparently, I think he was once asked where the title came from. He said it didn't, I don't know if it related to any of the essays, he said that it was a dream that his boyfriend had where he dreamt somebody was reading a book called Dress Your Family in Corduroy and Denim, and I think he thought, that's a great title for a book, which, if that's true, that is incredible.
Yeah, well, it's not mentioned anywhere in any of the essays. It's definitely just plucked out of the air. But it's not a forgettable title either. I can reach for that when I'm recommending books.
Well, you're listening to the Read All About It podcast with me, Paul Cuddihy, and my guest, Adam Farrar. And we're on to book 4. And from a book you'd recommend to anyone, we're now on to a book that you could not be paid to read again.
Yeah, I was concerned about this because I don't like to criticize other people's writing. And originally I was going to go for Heart of Darkness, which is a book I hate, like a very short but very painful book to read. But I think the one that really sticks with me is called Hard Landing by Stephen Leather. And it's a thriller. It was the first book I bought on Kindle. So it was 99p. And I thought, yeah, I'll give that a punt. And it's ludicrous. Like, it's really, really ridiculous. It's about a guy called Spider, who's an elite undercover cop. He infiltrates a drug gang and ends up in prison and trying to ingratiate himself with this gang so he can, bring them down. It feels to me like it was written by a software program that someone had just put in thriller and it had automatically done it. Spider is a guy who's like always attractive to women. He wins every fight that he's in. And I don't mind spoiling this book. It ends with him parachuting onto an oil tanker off the coast of South America and then winning a fight there. It's so ludicrous. I think if it was a film that starred Jackie Chan, I would love it. I think it was perfect. But that I had to give it reading time, I felt a bit robbed. Even though it was 99p, I felt stolen time from me.
Well, apparently, because I wasn't aware of the book at all, and I think it's the first book in, I think there's 17 in the series with this character, and also I think Stephen Leather has been phenomenally successful selling Kindle books.
Yeah, he's an incredibly successful author, and I can't take that away from him. He's won awards. He won an award for this book, which I think is stunning that happened. But good for
But
Stephen.
not in a good way.
Yeah, it's like it wasn't like any sort of raspberry award. I think it was. Is it called the Golden Dagger or the Steel Dagger? One of those.
It was one
Prize.
for the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger.
That's it. Yeah, and it's stunning to me. But he is hugely popular, so it could just be me. I feel I don't know if I can, in good conscience, recommend that you read it, but you could give it a try just so you understand where I'm coming from, because it's just so ridiculously unbelievable. It feels like Jeremy Clarkson would love this book. He's the kind of person that I'd imagine reading it and thinking it was cracking. But me, yeah. I've got a friend who was a prison librarian, and Stephen Leather's books are incredibly popular in prison libraries. I think partly because maybe he's really authentically recreated what it's like to be in a prison. I don't know, but I can't relate to that at all.
Because I'm just thinking that question I always ask about you couldn't recommend to anyone. I might just retitle it now, a book you think Jeremy Clarkson would like. Because I think if you saw that in the front cover, you would just go a mile, run a mile away.
That's it. Yeah, it's a hard nope, isn't it? You see that on a book. It's like, nope. Okay, I definitely know that's not for me. And that would have been helpful. If that had said that on Amazon, I would probably not have purchased it. But I'm glad I'm through it. It's an experience like dying on stage. It's a thing that I've gone through and I've learned from, and I won't make the mistake again.
Because it's interesting when I'm just doing some research, and I think back in 2011, Stephen Leather has sold something in the region of 500,000 ebooks, and he was voted one of the 100 most influential people in UK publishing. But then the following year, when I was reading that, I had a vague memory of there was a storm where he was involved with creating phony Twitter accounts in the name of another writer, and then using that to praise his own books, so kind of generating his own publicity, and ended up the Observer, I think, had done the investigation. So there was a whole lot of furore about it, and for somebody who's selling 500,000 copies of ebooks, seems a strange thing to do.
This is where you find out that he's bought 500,000 ebooks himself under ghost accounts. That would explain a lot. But yeah, well done to Stephen Leather for doing that. I wish I could sell 500,000 ebooks.
Yeah, maybe he bought 499,999. Jeremy Clarkson bought the other one.
Yeah, poor old me.
Yeah. Just before we move on, you mentioned, because you were debating between Hard Landing and then Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which obviously maybe people might not have read that, but a lot of people know that it was the basis of the inspiration for Apocalypse Now, the film. But what was it you didn't like about that book?
I think very early on it annoyed me, because I don't know if your memory is really good of the text, but I was double checking this yesterday ahead of the podcast. I looked at the PDF of the text, because what I remember the first time I read it was that he described the weather as brooding gloom over and over again on the first page. And 6 times on the first 2 pages, he describes the same thing, like the haze in the air by the water, as brooding gloom. And I remember finding that offensive. Like, God, how lazy. Like, I'm lazy, but I'm not so lazy I'd use the same description over and over again, hoping that the reader would forget that I'd already used it. And I found it felt like a real slog. There's also, have you read The Tin Drum?
Yes.
I found that to be a slog as well, because The Tin Drum is it's a big old book.
Yeah, I actually loved it.
The thing that's stuck in my head about that, and why I don't hate it, is because when they go eel fishing with a horse's head, I like that as a visual. So that was a positive thing I took from it. But Heart of Darkness, yeah, it bored me from beginning to end. I like Apocalypse Now, and I like that something good was drawn from it. So there are some positives that stop me from damning it completely, but I don't see that there's any positives about Hard Landing by Stephen Leather. So, and the only reason that I didn't throw it out of my window after reading it was that it was on my Kindle. Otherwise, that would have happened.
Is it still on your Kindle?
It is, yeah. I don't know if you can. Can you delete books from Kindle?
I think you can go on your account, and I'm sure you can delete them.
I guess that's my equivalent of a diary. There's all the bad decisions I've made in my life are sitting in my Kindle purchases. I should keep them. That's a warning.
Because I was going to ask you earlier on, but now that you've brought obviously Kindle up, in terms of, I've asked people before of how they read, whether they prefer physical books, whether ebooks, but you'd mentioned a couple of times as well audiobooks, in terms of you'd listen to on the road, but then also the David Sedaris. And do you have any preference, or is it just a kind of case of mix and match?
Yeah, it's a real mix and match thing. Like there are some books that like on the road, I knew that I would not find the time to sit down and read it. So that was an instinctive audio purchase. I always, if Sedaris puts out a book, I will buy the physical copy and I'll read that, and then I will listen to the audiobook because I want to have the two different versions of it. But yeah, I tend to mix. I buy, like most people, I buy far too many books, and there's an enormous stack beside my bed.
Is that such a thing?
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah, it's something that I could be shamed for, but I still buy them. I bought 3 books this morning, and there are literally 20 books on the side of my bed. It's like, oh, I can always have more because
Exactly.
they're beautiful things. They're furniture, they're decoration, they're enriching. There's so many reasons why you should just carry on buying them. So.
Exactly. I'm very much of the same opinion as you, that I think sometimes you do buy books because they do look they just look stunning. One book, actually, I don't know if you've read it, it came out last year. It was called The Secret Life of Books and Why They Mean More Than Words by Tom Moll. I think he's a university professor in Edinburgh. And it's the story of the creation and the evolution of books through the centuries and what it's meant to people, to civilizations, to cultures. And as a book lover, it's a brilliant book and a brilliant celebration of that physical product.
Oh, great. The Secret Life of Books, did you say?
Yeah.
I'll write this down. Ace. That'll be another, after this conversation, I'll be straight onto Amazon. It's like, yeah, I've never had a drug addiction, but I think that's the closest that I'm going to get.
And I'm going to say, I mean, I could be contradicted here. It's probably not the sort of book that Jeremy Clarkson would read, so you certainly will enjoy it for that
Even
reason.
more encouraged. Wonderful.
We are on to the fifth and final question, and that is either the last book you read or the book that you're currently reading.
Yeah, and it's the one I'm currently reading. It's the Gathering Tide by Karen Lloyd, and it's a memoir about Morecambe Bay. Because the reason I bought it is because recently we had Storm Dennis that was just destroying the country, and we were told to stay in our homes. And my friend and I had arranged to take a trip to Morecambe Bay that weekend. So it's like, oh, it's just a bit of rain, it'll be fine. We'll go and do it anyway. And we got onto the motorway, and the traffic slowed to about 5 miles an hour. There was zero visibility, and I was like, I'm going to kill us. Like, we're actually going to die on this journey. And then we got to Morecambe, had this wonderful day. The weather was perfect. It was all kind of beautiful. And then because we'd survived that, we had such a lovely time. I asked my friend out, and she's now my girlfriend. It's the journey that cemented our relationship, because we'd gone through something very dangerous together and had a great time. And afterwards I was like, God, I really liked that day, and I liked the experience we had. So I was looking for books about Morecambe, and that was the first one I came across. And it really tied in with my own book as well. But it's a memoir about living by the coast, because she talks about her memories of Morecambe and the various things that have happened, like the cockle pickers who drowned. There's a nuclear power station just further down the coast, so that's quite interesting. So I'm looking at this as a bit of a guide for my own work, really.
When I saw, for example, that I think it's Saraban Books that publish it, then I think they're a really good independent publisher, so I think there's a kind of real quality control in what they do. So right away, although I haven't not read the book, I'm thinking that is going to be a good read, because I know they take real care with everything that they do. But obviously you mentioned it was your experience in Morecambe and what came out of that brought you to the book. But again, once you stumbled upon that because of what you are doing yourself in terms of your writing, did that just make it more appealing?
Yeah, it felt like fate that I'd come across this book. And actually, Karen submitted something to The Real Story around the same time that I bought the book. It was a tremendous piece of nature writing about the natural reintroduction of wolves into Europe, and how there are now wolves in the Netherlands, like just they're wandering around these towns and wandering along the coastline. It's kind of, and again, that sort of thing tied in with some of the stories that I've been writing about the coastline that I'm writing about, which sort of faces the Netherlands. So it's quite, her writing seems to dovetail with mine quite neatly. She's been writing about wolves, and I've been writing about, there's a werewolf that has apparently been mutilating animals at a puffin sanctuary on the Holderness coast. And I've been interviewing various sort of UFO truthers and people who believe that it's this werewolf has arrived from a parallel universe to pull these sheep apart. It's a very strange. I don't believe this, but I find it to be a very compelling story, and that it's a weird story that people have built around the region. So she hasn't written about werewolves, but there seems to be some parallel between her wolf writing on the coast and my werewolf writing on the coast.
As a reader as well, and obviously as someone who writes creative non-fiction, is it quite nice as well when you then stumble upon a new book by a new writer and you just discover that talent that's within those pages?
As the editor of the Real Story, I get so many amazing pieces of creative non-fiction writing every day. So I'm always, like, my inbox is a repository of all these different angles that people have taken to approach non-fiction writing. Because there's no set way to do it, really. Some people are experimental, and some people are they tell these very sort of linear tales about their stories. Some people will tell their stories in a poetry form. So I'm very excited always by finding the ways that people approach this kind of writing.
Because another writer that's come up a few times in the podcast with various guests, it's a Scottish writer called Kathleen Jamie, I think she's a poet first and foremost, but I think she's written a couple of collections of essays, and it's very much in that kind of same vein of nature writing. And two or three people that I've spoke about her really rave about the kind of perceptive way she looks at the world and looks at things and looks at people and places. And again, that might be another one just to look out for.
Well, the poets, I've found, tend to be the most natural creative non-fiction writers. We published a piece by a poet called Lenny Sanders. She's also a really wonderful spoken word performer. But the lyrical writing and the attention to detail, it's incredible. They're already calibrated to view the world in this very particular detailed way. And when they expand upon that into a long form essay, yeah, it particularly does something to me. Her writing is beautiful. And when she submitted, we often, there's a team of us that edit people's work, and she was someone that we just didn't need to touch. She'd done it all so completely naturally. It was her first piece of essay writing, but through years and years of poetry experience, it was all there. It was all perfect.
That's so rare for any writer to be that perfect, you know?
Yeah, well, because she's, I think her muscles, her writing muscles are so well tuned that, yeah, it was completely natural for her. So I've been encouraging her to write more, but I think she's retreated back into poetry because there's an emotional burden with creative nonfiction. Like, if you're digging into something that's really personal, and normally this is the first piece of creative nonfiction people write is generally about the most challenging thing that's ever happened to them. So we get a lot of submissions from people who have woken up in hospital from a horrendous operation, or someone's died. It's always the worst stuff. And some people do really, once they write a piece of creative nonfiction, never want to do it again. So I'm not going to push her too much, but I think she should write more because she's incredible.
Is that I'm guessing that is one of the great joys as somebody who does love creative non-fiction, when you're certainly the editor of the Real Story, that, as you say, that people are sending you some beautiful pieces of writing that you get to see firsthand, and you know, you're almost the first person to read it.
Yeah, and it feels like it's kind of an honor really to have that stuff, because people with a true story, they're giving you their whole heart. You know, it's not something they just made up. This is like, okay, this is a really personal thing that has happened to me, and I'm trusting you with it. And sometimes people's true stories should just remain as diary entries, because they're not the writers that they would need to be to fully realize their story. But I always reply to those people and constructive and thank them for sending it to us, because it's a big thing to give your truth to someone else.
And when I was reading, obviously, the introduction to what you do, and the last thing I'd mentioned was you had received a grant from the Arts Council England to complete your first book. And obviously, we spoke about how the impact of the lockdown just now. But do you have a schedule in terms of when you'd like to complete the book, or is that now up in the air, or are you still just working on it?
It's been pushed back because I'm working with the novelist Jen Ashworth, and I'm doing these monthly sessions where I send her an essay, and we Skype and we discuss how the book is progressing. And we probably got about 80% through it. And I was just writing a piece about the economy in this town called Withensea, where my family all live. And it's already on a knife edge because it's reliant on dwindling tourism. And now with the lockdown, that knife has been completely taken away, and I don't really know how the town is going to survive. So I need to take some time to look at that properly, and I won't be able to do it until the lockdown has passed, whenever that will be. So I'll give myself a few more months. But ideally, I was looking to finish it by August, and that doesn't seem like that's going to happen now.
Do you have other projects on the go at the same time, or are you just focused solely on that?
Well, I've got the writer-in-residence for Peel Park in Salford. I've got a whole load of essays to write for that as well, because I covered a year in the life of that park. and I was given access to the park keeper's diaries from 100 years ago, and there's all these mad little stories. Like, there used to be a natural history museum in Salford, and it closed sometime in the 1930s, I think. They laid off a load of staff, and in protest, lots of the staff stole the exhibits. So they were just walking home with stuffed tigers and bears and ostriches. And I started speculating on the idea that they're somewhere in Salford. People are going to, so their relatives will die of old age, and they go and clear the house out and find a gorilla in the loft without explanation. So there's lots of things to dig into with that as well. So I've got a whole year of research around that park, which my residency's finished in March, at the end of winter. So I'm never running out of things to write about. And then my mum calls me up and tells me another story about her dance class or something she's doing, and there's another story, so it just never stops.
And in terms of your reading, obviously we were speaking about The Gathering Tide, and then also the ever expanding list of books at the side of your bed. And do you know what you're going to be reading next, or is it just something that once you finish that book you'll just see where the mood takes you? Yeah, well,
there's a book by Ross Gay called The Book of Delights, which is one that I've been dipping into a lot because it contains, he calls them essayettes. They're like essays that are about 100 or 150 words. So that's you can dip into it very easily. And he's a poet, again, writing really beautifully and observed, sort of perfectly manicured short stories. So that's one that I will dip in and out of. I'm also reading Notes to Self by Emily Pine, which is one I started and thought, no, I need to finish The Gathering Tide before I read that. But that's been highly recommended as well. That's where I'll be jumping next.
Sadly, Adam, we've just about come to the end of the podcast. It's been really good talking to you. If anybody wants to go over any of Adam's book choices, you go onto my website, www.paulcuddihy.com, and there's a page for each of the guests on the podcast where I just list all the book choices and the book recommendations, and the book that only Jeremy Clarkson would read as well, which is now, I think, what we are going to call that category. But as I say, it's been really good talking to you, Adam, and really look forward to when your book, The Lost Villages of Holderness, does come out.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Read All About It podcast, and I'd love to hear what you thought about it. You can get in touch via Twitter at ReadAllAbout20, on Instagram at ReadAllAboutItPodcast, or you can send an email to readallaboutit@paulcuddihy.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, subscribe, leave a review and spread the word. If you haven't enjoyed it, say nothing to anybody. But I do hope you can join me, Paul Cuddihy, next time on the Read All About It podcast. And in the meantime, keep reading.